Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the role of Russia and its involvement in world affairs, especially how Russia flexes their muscles to intimidate the countries in the neighborhood. On that issue, Zapad means west in Russian. Zapad is also the code name given to Russia's latest set of war games. The war games took place between September 14th and September 20th. They played out on Russia's Western Front, hence the name. Close to the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and very close to Poland and inside Belarus. Russia's neighbors in the region share a serious fear that what starts out under the pretext of war games will be a precursor for invasion, occupation, and even annexation. The Russian response is that this fear is crazy, an overreaction. They claim that the games are simply war exercises, that what you see is what you get. To understand what is really happening here, we must examine the context in which it's all happening. Because on February 20th, 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Despite international condemnation and sanctions, they have no intention of leaving. Understandably, that has caused regional tension to rise. Southeast Asia is also experiencing rising tensions as a result of missile tests and war games that North Korea, the United States are all engaging in. When North Korea launches a missile over Japan, and when the US just flies 2 BB-1 supersonic bombers and 4 stealth F-35 fighter jets, accompanied by 4 South Korean F-15 jets, tensions and regional unease is a very appropriate response. Russia, North Korea, and the United States are all transmitting messages. They're sending messages in code. It's up to us to decipher the code and understand the messages correctly. There are important reasons for conducting war games in public. The obvious reason is so participating countries and players can practice together and get accustomed to their characters, playing style, weapons that they're playing with. It's all the best way to show your stuff and learn how to synchronize with the others. And testing weapons is always essential. But as all military personnel know, the same thing can be done, as it often is, behind closed doors via computers and simulators. Live action war today is very similar to the virtual computer war games played on home computers and laptops. The simulators are very real, as are the computer screens. Much of today's real wars are, in actuality, fought by pencil protector keyboard punchers. Even pilots fit into that category. Fighter jets can be flown anywhere, and there are numerous ways to replicate terrain. Next to running actual missions in real time, the best representation of any conflict or enemy response is to use a computer. Fighting with a program and a computer is better than an exercise and a war game. This is especially true when you have a real human being fighting against you on the simulator. So why is Russia, the country known for its cloak and dagger approach to international engagement, now choosing to orchestrate war games so open to the public that they might as well be broadcast on primetime TV? There are 2 critical reasons. On the international level, Russia wants to send out messages about their military might and prowess specifically in order to intimidate their neighbors and frighten the world and show just how serious they are. On the local level, Moscow wants to instill national pride. While it is true that military analysts pay very close attention to publicly played war games and evaluate and judge weapons and skills, these games are more closely aligned with a military parade than they are with actual war. They are an opportunity to strut your stuff and cheer for your team. That is especially true for the actors in the game. Russian officials are steadfastly sticking to the script that claims that Zapad 2017 is nothing more than practice. So why have the Russians made advance arrangements for more than 80 times the number of rail cars and transport vans that were used for the same set of war games that took place in 2013? People are worried. U.S. General Philip Breedlove, the Supreme Commander of NATO, is among the worried. His information suggests that the Russian activity will include as many as 100,000 forces. In Breedlove's words, that is, quote, a bit alarming, unquote. According to the general speaking at the Senate hearing, the 2017 games will be demonstrably bigger than the 2013 games. This is what he says. The Russians have ordered 83 times the rail cars that they ordered for Zapad in 2013. Russia said 10,000 troops took part in the 2013 drills, which spanned across Russian territory and involved all branches of its military. The fear is not that Russians will invade any of their neighbors during Zapad. The real fear is that they will leave their weapons in place for a later invasion. If they do, it will be a Russian version of the Roman Trojan horse. The war games will move thousands of heavy weapons, including tanks and cannons and Hummers and helicopters and anti-aircraft weapons, onto the field and in place. When the time is right, they can be swiftly deployed. Russians can insist as much as they want that this is a defensive move. They can repeat it over and over and that they have no aggressive intentions. And they can say that they are not even using the names of their neighboring countries in Zapad 2017 war games. But the names they are using are so transparent that it's hard to take any of their claims seriously. Watch these games carefully. The IDF also engaged in the largest exercises they've done in the last 20 years. The war games took place from September 4th through September 14th and played out in the north of Israel, on Israel's border with Lebanon and Syria. Every year, Israel conducts war games in that area. This year's games are different. These games are designed to send a very clear message to Hezbollah, to Iran, and to Syria. Not much information has been released about the war games, but we can certainly assume that the IDF utilized the multi-layered components of Israel's defense system. There are the three stages in these war games that I can determine. First is an airstrike model, second is a ground strike, and the third is to move and repel the invaders back to their borders. Variations of this exercise have always been beneficial to IDF forces and their commanders. This year, even more so. This year's IDF war games are doubling as a media message to the enemy. Back to Russia. On a similar and more productive side, Russia and China are worried about the North Korean nuclear tests. The two presidents, Putin and Xi, said that they are working together to, quote, appropriately deal with, unquote, the North Korean nuclear saber rattling. The two met in the southern Chinese city of Ximen as part of the BRICS economic group. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They are a group of 5 of the most growing emerging economies in the world, and they meet to compare notes and assist one another with their growth. China and Russia are clearly united in their objective to keep North Korea from advancing its nuclear capabilities. The best way to achieve that end is to coordinate their approach and next steps. This meeting underscored for us just how closely aligned Russia and China are. They're on the same page, and they're speaking at the highest levels. Now about Iran. Iran convicted a Shiite religious leader and sentenced him to death. He was convicted of blasphemy and creating a cult. In reality, the Shiite leader created a new age style of Shiite Islam. It's a form of liberalizing of Islam. His lawyer will appeal the decision. There was a very similar case to this in 2014 in Iran, and after appeal, the death penalty was reduced and the cleric remains in prison for life. Iranians are looking to control the growth of Shiite Islam. They can't tolerate and do not understand the growth of religious ideas in the modern world. Ultimately, Iran will not be able to restrict the natural evolution of new ideas that has always influenced Islam. For centuries, external forces improved Islam. Shutting out those forces is a recipe for failure for Iran. On the positive side, for Iran, it looks like Iran is following the nuke deal. The IAEA, the international agency that is actually the watchdog supervising Iran's nuclear development, delivered its third report on Iran since January. They concluded that Iranians are following both the spirit and the letter of the famous, or as some would consider it, the infamous nuke deal of March 2015. This is important news. The White House has accused Iran of violating the deal. Congress has asserted that Iran is playing footloose and fancy-free with the deal. But the only group qualified to actually determine whether Iran is cooperating is the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they say that everything is A-OK. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. Both columns come from the New York Post today. The New York Post has some very engaging and thoughtful regular columnists. They're all pro-Israel. It's a pleasure to read the opinion section of the New York Post. It is unheard of to read a piece that is unfair to Israel. Even in their critique, or when there is a critique, they frame it in a way that there is no seething hatred towards the Jewish state. First up is a column by Benny Avni. Avni is a regular columnist for the New York Post. He used to be at the New York Sun, and before that, he was at Newsweek. This column was published online in the New York Post on August 29, 2017. The title was, UN Failure is Leading to Another Lebanon War. It was published in the next day's print edition on August 30th, 2017, entitled, Failure Force, UN Won't Stop Hezbollah's New March to War. The difference in the titles is significant. This is how Avni begins. Precision-guided missile factories are being built in Lebanon and Syria, and unless the UN stops them, Israel will. That, more or less, was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's message to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in Jerusalem on Monday. The new UN chief vowed to do everything in my capacity to make sure that the UN interim force in Lebanon fully meets its mandate. UNIFIL, established after Israel's 2006 war with Hezbollah in South Lebanon, was charged with disarming Hezbollah. It didn't. Avni now explains part of the context. He's trying to explain the crazy situation in Lebanon, how explosive it is, and how well-armed Hezbollah is. The UN Security Council is set to renew UNIFIL's mandate Wednesday. It automatically does so each year, even as Hezbollah, no longer a ragtag organization, now commands a formidable Lebanese-based army that dominates vast swaths in Syria, with tentacles in Yemen, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, all while the UN forces look on. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has amassed over 100,000 missiles and other arms hidden in plain view at private homes or under schools and infirmaries, ready to hit neighboring Israel. And as Bibi noted Monday, new factories in Lebanon and Syria would allow Hezbollah to manufacture missiles there, rather than risk losing them en route from Hezbollah's patron, Iran. Then Avni explains that this, was in a nutshell the conversation that transpired between the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres. According to Avni, Bibi said, "This is something Israel cannot accept. This is something the United Nations should not accept," the Prime Minister told Guterres. Now, Avni lays out the point of view of the U.S. through the voice of the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. He writes, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley wants change. On Friday, she told reporters that UNIFIL commander, Major General Michael Berry of Ireland, is the only person in South Lebanon who was blind to Hezbollah's arming. In an unprecedented personal rebuke, Haley added, "That's an embarrassing lack of understanding on what's going on around him." Haley said she wouldn't accept an automatic renewal of the force's mandate, demanding more robust action on Hezbollah's arms. Avni now concludes that the situation is on the cusp of war, and Hezbollah is not about to disarm. This is what he writes. The devastation of such a war on both sides and the likely widening of the region's instability should worry policymakers worldwide. We must reassess our belief that a legitimate Lebanese government will disarm Hezbollah, and those who lulled themselves into believing the UN is on the case need to rethink. We need a new global strategy to isolate and declaw Hezbollah via sanctions, weapons interception, and when needed, military means, and fast. Second up is a column by Jonathan Tobin. Jonathan Tobin is an opinion editor of the JNS.org news and a contributing writer to National Review. He was the editor of Commentary Online, and before that, he was the editor of the Jewish Exponent of Philadelphia. This piece comes from the New York Post. In print, it is called O's Gift to Iran. Hamas is back in Tehran's pocket as war looms. And it was published on August 31st, 2017. Online, the column is entitled Obama's Middle East Legacy, Iran's Puppets All Around Israel with War on the Way. It was published the day before on August 30th, 2017. Honestly, I don't even really understand the online title. Sometimes titles selected do not actually convey the message of the piece. Here, Hassal Tobin begins. There are some mistakes for which the world never seems to stop paying. When the United States chose to let Syria slide into chaos while simultaneously seeking to end the isolation of Iran with a nuclear deal, President Barack Obama thought he was avoiding trouble and giving Iran a chance to get right with the world. Now Tobin explains that the mistakes of Obama are the reason why the situation is so troubling today. He writes, by backing down on his red line warning on the use of chemical weapons and then punting responsibility for that issue to Russia, which allowed Assad to continue using them, Obama also ensured that Syria would become a land bridge between Tehran and its Hezbollah auxiliaries in Lebanon. Obama thought intervention would have been an obstacle to his hopes for a rapprochement with Tehran, nor did he let Iran's refusal to give up its nuclear program stop his push for a deal that vastly enriched the regime while only delaying its quest for a nuclear weapon. Now Tobin brings in Iran and the strength and power and position they now feel. Tobin writes, the result, Iran is stronger and bolder than ever and building weapons factories in Lebanon and Syria. By reconciling with Hamas, it has the capacity to create what might be a three-front war against the Jewish state whenever it chooses to heat up the conflict. With Iran behind it, Hamas, which has already rearmed and refortified Gaza since the 2014 war with Israel, is not only better able to restart hostilities, but also now more of a threat to its Fatah rivals in the West Bank. Tobin now concludes, and with Hamas back in its pocket, Iran has the ability to veto peace with the Jewish state they still vow to eliminate. What can Trump do? The options are limited, but he must begin by realizing that sticking to Obama's decision to let Russians and Iranians have Syria is a mistake. The same applies to listening to those who have so far persuaded him not to start the process of rolling back the nuclear deal. Trump will probably never get the Middle East peace deal he wants, but doubling down on Obama's mistakes will only increase the risk of more Middle Eastern wars that he wishes to avoid. The Iran-Hamas reunion is a warning that policies that strengthen Russia and its Iranian allies are blunders Israel and the West will keep paying for in blood and treasure. This is a very sad and true depiction of a gift that never stops giving. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to discuss three cartoons today. The first is called Antifa, and it's drawn by Rick McKee and was published on August 30th, 2017 in the Augusta Journal. A worried typical American is getting support from an ISIS terrorist with a knife. He is relieved and says, "Oh, you're with ISIS. Whew. For a minute, I thought you were one of the Antifa hoodlums." Next up is a cartoon from Kegel Cartoons and was published August 29th, 2017. It's drawn by Gary McCoy. The devil is looking in his closet, wondering which outfit he should wear. Hanging in the closet is an Antifa black hood and handkerchief face mask, and the white hood and cloak of the KKK. The devil asks himself, what to wear today? Our last cartoon up is from Creative Syndicate, published August 30th, 2017, drawn by Marshall Ramsey. A normal guy is watching the TV news. The correspondent is in Houston, covering the hurricane and the flood, and the TV monitor reads, "Houston Water Rescues." The correspondent says, "We interrupt our regularly scheduled, pointless political bickering to remind you humanity still exists." In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. China and Saudi Arabia just signed a $70 billion deal in which the Saudis will be purchasing goods and services from China. That's a huge deal. Not only will it be a tremendous boost for the Chinese economy, it will also mean that the Chinese will now be less dependent on the US. The deal involves media, postal services, trade, energy, and communications. It is a massive investment on the part of Saudi Arabia. They are investing in China to buoy their future. This is such an important deal that it actually has its own name. It's called Looking to the Future 2030. The most important thing to remember is that the Saudis are moving towards China. China has become a provider. It is no longer only self-oriented and internally focused. ISIS has been ousted from the Lebanese-Syrian border. They have moved east towards their stronghold on the Iraqi-Syrian border. Making up the ISIS convoy were 308 fighters and 331 others. As the convoy moved, the United States blew up the road and the bridge that ISIS members needed to travel to reunite with their group. The ISIS ceasefire was created between Hezbollah, the Lebanese army, and ISIS. The entire objective was to oust ISIS from that border, and they succeeded. The US, however, is not obligated to uphold that agreement, and that is why they blasted the road. Ryan Dillon, the US spokesman for the coalition, put it very clearly and succinctly. Quote, he says, "We did create the road and destroy the small bridge to prevent this convoy from moving further east. We're not bound by these ceasefire agreements. They're clearly fighters, and they're moving to another location to fight yet again. In accordance with the law of armed conflict, we will strike them if we are able to do so," unquote. There is no rule of war that permits terrorists to relocate. Giles de Kerchove, the European Union's counterterrorism coordinator, gave his evaluation of the future of terror in Europe. He used England as an example. He said that the United Kingdom has identified 20 to 35,000 radicals. Breaking down the radical groups even further, de Kerchove went on to explain that 3,000 are worrying for MI5, and of those, 500 are under constant and special attention. By comparison, de Kerchove said that France has 17,000, Spain many less, but more than 5,000, I suppose. In Belgium, 500 have been to Syria, and there are around 2,000 radicals or more. In short, Europe is infested with potential terrorists. De Kerchove said, "I wouldn't like to put a concrete figure on it, but in Europe, tens of thousands, more than 50,000. De Kerchove has a plan for dealing with these potential terrorists. We must select those who are really worrying and the most dangerous, and they should be monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." His conclusion is based on the principle that the terrorists need not travel to the Middle East anymore. The propaganda of the organization no longer requires people to go to the caliphate. They can attack in their places of origin, including on a small scale with homemade weapons. This is a sobering and welcome evaluation. It means that Europe and European leadership is finally waking up to the threat of terror. Hopefully this message will be received by those who can benefit from the evaluation. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Did you know that during the 19th century, a huge swath of land in Russia is where Jews were required to live between 1791 and 1917? That is for 120 years. It was called the Pale of Settlement. A Jew needed special permission to live outside the Pale. It is in that area that the Russian war games are taking place. Catherine the Great originally created the Pale, as it's called. It was there that the shtetls were situated. It was there that Tsar Alexander III enacted his fierce anti-Semitic rulings. Alexander had a third plan for the Jews. Make the conditions so bad that a third of the Jews would die, a third would convert, and a third would just run away and disappear. It was here where the notorious pogroms took place, especially the Kishinev pogroms. Pogroms were organized riots against the Jews during which the Jews were beaten, raped, murdered, and their property was burned, plundered, and stolen, all with the sponsorship of the authorities, local and national. All of this is romanticized in the works of the great Yiddish writers, especially that of Shalom Rabinovich, a.k.a. Shalom Aleichem, in his short stories about Tevye the milkman, which became the foundation, of course, for Fiddler on the Roof. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.